Step out of the vehicle right now, ma'am, or I will remove you myself. The command cut through the cold Chicago morning with a force that did not match the moment, yet it landed with the weight of something deliberate. Officer Derek Vaughn stood outside Judge Alicia Bennett's black Mercedes GLE, his hand resting on the latch of his holster, his voice sharp, impatient, and unshaken by the badge she had already presented. The blue lights behind him pulsed against the concrete under the Michigan Avenue viaduct, signaling to the cars rushing past that something serious was happening. When in truth, the only thing unfolding was an abuse of authority disguised as routine police work. Alicia had identified herself 3 times, her tone steady, her credentials undeniable, her registration perfect. Dispatch had already confirmed the vehicle was clean, but Vaughn acted as if none of it mattered. He leaned forward, his breath visible in the cold air, and said again, "Slower this time. Step out of the vehicle." Alicia knew the law. She knew her rights. She knew the rules of engagement in a pretextual stop, but she also knew the look in the officer's eyes. It was the look she had seen from the bench over the years. The look of a man who had long mistaken authority for power and routine for entitlement. A deep part of her feared what would come next. She opened the door. Vaughn yanked her wrist before her feet touched the ground. The cuffs clicked louder than she expected. A bystander gasped. Another began recording. The judge, who had spent decades defending the Constitution, now stood at the mercy of someone who refused to acknowledge it. Before going into this story, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from, and if you find value in stories like this. Subscribe to the channel and give me a like. Alicia Bennett had left her home that morning prepared for one of the most consequential hearings of her career. She was minutes away from presiding over proceedings that could place the entire Chicago Police Department under federal oversight for systemic racial profiling in traffic stops. She carried her final notes in the passenger seat, neatly tabbed and ready. Her clerk, Maya Thompson, was already at the courthouse reviewing last-minute filings. Assistant State's Attorney Jordan Lee, an old classmate and trusted colleague, was preparing his own arguments for the day. The hearing was set to begin at 9. At 8:18, the blue lights appeared. Vaughn approached the vehicle with a posture that carried certainty rather than curiosity. He said he stopped her due to a broken taillight, yet both lights glowed steadily behind her. When she mentioned this, he waved off her words as if they were an inconvenience. She handed him her license, her judicial identification, and the car's registration. He glanced at none of it. Instead, he stepped back, placed a hand on his radio, and said, "Possible refusal to comply." Alicia watched his lips move, saw the familiar pattern of escalation where escalation had no place. Her instincts told her something was off, something intentional, something orchestrated. Dispatch came back within seconds, vehicle registered, no flags. The driver confirmed. Vaughn ignored it. He tapped the side of her car with his flashlight, then told her to put her hands where he could see them. She did. He reached for the door handle before she could open it herself. She repeated, calmly, "Officer, I am a federal judge on my way to a scheduled court proceeding. My credentials are lawful and current. You have the confirmation from dispatch." Vaughn replied, "Ma'am, step out." It was not a request. It was a threat wrapped in a command, and it triggered something she only rarely allowed herself to feel: fear. When Alicia stepped onto the pavement, the temperature cut through her coat. Vaughn spun her around, locked her wrists, and searched her with the practiced impatience of someone accustomed to acting without challenge. The cuffs bit into her skin. She remained silent, counting every breath. Cars slowed as commuters noticed the scene. A few glanced with the detached curiosity of a city used to police encounters. Others stared with concern, sensing something was wrong but unsure what. Then came Kevin Patel. He had been on his way to open his convenience store a block away when he saw the officer's posture, the cuffs, and the unmistakable tension. He lifted his phone and began recording. He did not speak. He did not intervene. He simply filmed, capturing the moment the judge straightened her back, lifted her chin, and said with quiet resolve, "Officer, you are making a serious mistake." Vaughn replied. "Keep your voice down," she said. "I will not." It was then that commuters began whispering. Who was she? Why was she being cuffed? And why did the officer look angrier the calmer she became? Inside her chest, something tightened. She had known the department was under scrutiny. She had known some officers resented the oversight the federal courts were considering. She had known there were whispers, resistance, even hostility, but she had not expected this. Not today. Not on the morning she was set to preside over a case that could reshape Chicago's policing for a generation. Vaughn's radio crackled with a second confirmation from dispatch. Clean, clear, valid. He silenced it with a thumb. He pulled her toward the squad car, ignoring each word she spoke. Then he reached for his phone. The movement was small, almost casual, but Alicia caught it. And in that single gesture, she understood something chilling. He was not acting alone. At the curb, her notes lay scattered inside the Mercedes. The hearing materials she had reviewed before leaving home were now several steps behind her, unreachable, symbolizing more than just papers left in a car. They represented the truth of the moment. A judge, moments away from reviewing the city's record on racial bias, was now experiencing the very abuse she had spent her life studying, teaching, prosecuting, and judging. Kevin Patel kept recording as Vaughn placed her in the back of the squad car. His hands did not shake, his voice did not rise, but his eyes reflected urgency. This was no ordinary stop. He knew it. Everyone watching knew it. A woman who embodied the law had been reduced to a detainee. Not because of wrongdoing, but because an officer with a record of complaints had chosen to treat her as a target. The morning rush continued around them, unaware that what was happening under that viaduct would soon become the most powerful piece of evidence in the largest civil rights case the city had seen in decades. Alicia sat in the back seat of the squad car, her hands still bound. For the first time in years, she closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in preparation. She sensed the truth rising beneath the surface. This was no coincidence. This was no misunderstanding. This was a message, and she knew that once the truth emerged, it would not simply fall on one officer. It would fall on an entire system. Sergeant Lyle Harlan arrived with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he could still control a story that was already slipping through his fingers. And the moment he stepped out of his SUV, he recognized Judge Alicia Bennett immediately. Yet he allowed the search to continue without hesitation, speaking in a low voice to Officer Derek Vaughn as if giving him permission to ignore the truth unfolding before him. Alicia stood restrained beside the squad car, her wrists still bound, her voice steady but edged with disbelief as she repeated her identification for the fourth time, while Harlan nodded as though he heard nothing of substance, choosing instead to say, "Proceed as you were, officer," a sentence that revealed more about his intent than anything he had said in his 28 years of service. The decision to let the unlawful search continue did not come from confusion or uncertainty. It came from calculation. It came from a man who believed the blue wall would hold. And for one quiet moment on that cold Chicago morning, the street seemed to pause as if waiting to see whether anyone would intervene. The bystander, Kevin Patel, was still recording, his phone steady as the video captured every word, every dismissal, every shift in authority. He had started filming out of instinct. Now he kept recording out of a sense of responsibility, realizing the gravity of what he was witnessing. Jordan Lee approached seconds later, He had been driving toward the courthouse when he saw the flashing lights and the outline of Alicia's sedan. At first, he did not believe it. He thought his eyes were playing tricks on him through the morning glare. But when he stepped closer, recognition struck with the force of a blow. The judge he had known since law school, the woman who had mentored him, challenged him, encouraged him to join the state's attorney's office, was standing in handcuffs as if she were a threat rather than one of the most respected members of the federal judiciary. Something inside him rose. Disbelief, anger, duty. Without thinking, he reached for his phone, opened the live stream function, and angled the camera to capture the exact moment Alicia turned her head and said, with calm precision, "Jordan, document everything." Her voice carried no fear, only clarity. Harlan, noticing the live stream, took one step forward and said, "Sir, you need to step back," Jordan answered. "Sergeant, the entire city is about to see this. You should consider your next words carefully. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact." Harlan froze. Vaughn tensed. Alicia stood still, her breath steady. In the live stream chat, comments flooded in faster than Jordan could read them. Who is she? Why is she cuffed? Is that a judge? They're ignoring dispatch. Rewind the video. This is illegal. The view count rose in real time. Inside the Dirksen courthouse, Maya Thompson watched the live stream on her office monitor, her pulse quickening. She knew Alicia's schedule, her route, her habits. She knew exactly what hearing she was supposed to be preparing for. As the video widened and showed Alicia's bound wrists and the officer's dismissive posture, Maya reached for her phone and called the chief judge's chambers. She spoke with measured urgency, explaining the situation in plain terms, her voice steady but carrying the unmistakable note of someone who understood the severity of what she was reporting. "Your Honor, Judge Bennett is being detained on Lakeshore Drive. Yes, in handcuffs. I am watching it now. They are ignoring her identification." The response came in quick, clipped words. "Find out who the officers are. Keep the line open." Maya shifted between windows, cross-checking badge numbers, compiling a list of prior complaints, already piecing together the beginnings of a pattern that would soon expose far more than a single bad stop. Back on the street, Kevin's video reached 2 million views in less than an hour. His voice trembled slightly as he narrated what he saw, not with drama, but with the quiet conviction of someone who understood the stakes. They're not listening to her. She showed them everything. They're still cuffing her. This isn't right. His hands remained steady despite the cold. He had filmed countless minor incidents outside his store over the years. But this was different. This was history tightening its grip around a single moment. And then, as if the morning needed one final shift, Lieutenant Maria Gonzalez pulled up in her patrol car, stepped out, and surveyed the scene with a gaze that absorbed everything in seconds. She saw Alicia. She saw Vaughn's body language. She saw Harlan's posture. She saw Jordan live streaming. She saw the bystander with his phone raised high. She saw the growing tension between truth and the attempted cover-up forming right in front of her. Without saying a word, she reached to her chest and double-tapped her body camera, activating the audio recording with a subtle click. Harlan noticed. His jaw tightened. Vaughn stepped back. Alicia lifted her head slightly, the faintest sign that she understood what Gonzalez's action meant. The lieutenant walked toward the sergeant with a calm, even tone and said, "Sergeant, what is your directive here?" Her voice was clear, controlled, and it left no room for evasion. Harlan answered. Routine stop. His eyes avoided hers. She replied, "She is a federal judge." He said nothing. She stepped 1 inch closer and lowered her voice just enough for the body cam to catch every syllable. "Then explain why dispatch has cleared her vehicle twice, and she is still in restraints." Vaughn shifted uncomfortably. Harlan whispered, "Make it look routine." He said it with the confidence of a man who believed his words would evaporate into the air as they always had. But Maria knew the camera was recording. She knew the truth had just been captured on a device he had overlooked, and she knew that line, "Make it look routine," would become the sentence heard across the nation. Jordan's live stream caught the moment Gonzalez took a slow breath, looked toward him, nodded, and turned back to Alicia with a respectful tone. "Judge Bennett, do you require medical attention?" Alicia answered calmly. "No, Lieutenant, I require the law to be followed." The chat exploded with outrage and disbelief. Within minutes, reporters on the morning shift at WGN-TV and ABC Channel 7 Chicago began posting clips. The Tribune pushed out a breaking alert. The footage spread like a surge, carried by the certainty that something deeply wrong was happening. The escalation was no longer something a single officer or sergeant could control. The attempt to hide the truth had already failed. And as Alicia stood on the pavement, her hands still cuffed, she understood that this moment, this humiliating, unnecessary, deliberate encounter, would soon rise beyond the street, beyond the morning rush, and into the courtroom where power would shift with the weight of evidence no one could ignore. Judge Alicia Bennett entered the 18th District Station in handcuffs, her posture steady but marked by the quiet disbelief of someone who understood the law so thoroughly that the violation itself felt surreal. And the officers around her moved with the uneasy confidence of individuals who convinced themselves they could still salvage a narrative already collapsing under the weight of evidence accumulating by the second. Officer Derek Vaughn walked ahead with a stiffness that betrayed anxiety more than authority. Sergeant Lyle Harlan followed behind, whispering quick instructions to an officer at the desk, his voice sharp and clipped as he attempted to control the intake log. The body cam indexing, and the chain of custody before the truth slipped beyond his reach. Alicia said nothing. She allowed the silence to speak for her. She had presided over hundreds of wrongful detention hearings in her career, each one threaded with familiar patterns of abuse, misdirection, and sudden fear. Yet nothing prepared her for standing on the inside of the same machinery she had spent decades examining from the bench. The officers removed the cuffs without apology. She rubbed her wrists once, gently, not in pain, but in acknowledgement of what had been done. "Judge Bennett," one officer whispered under his breath, his eyes wide with recognition. "I'm so sorry." Before she could respond, Harlan stepped forward and barked. No talking, trying to reassert control, though the cracks in his command were already widening, in a corner office. Chief Elena Ramirez received an urgent call from the Chief Judge of the Northern District of Illinois. The words were direct. The tone was controlled. The message was unmistakable. "Your officers have detained a federal judge. They ignored identification. They ignored dispatch. They ignored the procedure." Ramirez felt the air shift inside her chest. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in denial, but in preparation for the fallout she knew was already forming. Ramirez was the department's first Latina superintendent, a leader caught daily between what the city demanded, what the rank and file resisted, and what justice required. She asked for the names. She asked for the precinct. She asked for the location. She asked for the footage. And as the answers came, her voice hardened with resolve. "I'm on my way. Do not let them release anything. Do not let them delete anything. I'll handle it." But she was already too late. The deletion had begun. Inside the station, Harlan issued quiet orders to 2 junior officers. "Pull the last 5 minutes. Lock the camera log. No exports. No copies." He spoke quickly, believing that authority alone would ensure obedience. One officer hesitated. The other complied without question. Vaughn stood to the side, staring at his boots, avoiding eye contact, He knew the policy, he knew the requirements, he knew the consequences of altering footage, but he also knew the culture he belonged to, one built on silence, protection, and unwritten rules. The station lights reflected against Alicia's glasses as she watched the orchestrated damage unfold. She recognized every gesture, every attempt to manipulate the narrative. She had seen it in case files for years. Now she saw it happening around her with a clarity so sharp it felt like a blade. Lieutenant Maria Gonzalez entered the station quietly, holding a simple evidence pouch against her chest. Inside it was the raw, unedited footage she had copied from the body cam system moments earlier. The version that included Harlan's whispered instruction. Make it look routine. She walked past Vaughn without a word. She walked past Harlan with the measured calm of someone who had already made her choice. She approached the evidence room but did not log the file. Instead, she slipped into a small side office, closed the door, and placed the pouch on the desk. She knew the department's internal systems were not safe. She knew the backups would be altered within hours. She knew the only way to protect the truth was to remove it entirely from the precinct's reach. She addressed the padded envelope sitting on the table and wrote one name in firm handwriting, Samuel Wright, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Without hesitation, she sealed the footage, walked to the outgoing mail chute, and pushed it through. She watched it disappear. In that moment, she crossed a line she could never return from. She became a whistleblower, and she understood the cost. Back in the station lobby, Alicia sat at a metal bench, her hands still resting in her lap, her breathing controlled. Dispatch logs updated on a monitor across the room, each entry a reminder that her stop had been cleared twice, and yet she was still here. A clerk approached with a clipboard, his hands trembling slightly. Your Honor, I need to confirm your personal information. Alicia looked at him with calm clarity. Of course. Her tone revealed nothing of the anger beneath the surface. She answered each question precisely. Professional. Unshaken. The clerk nodded and returned to his desk, rattled by the contrast between her composure and the chaos around him. At the courthouse, Maya Thompson had already pulled Officer Vaughn's personnel file. She expected complaints. She expected disciplinary notes. She expected gaps in training logs. What she found was worse. 8 prior complaints for racial profiling, 2 unresolved use-of-force claims, 3 warnings for failure to activate his body cam. But the most alarming discovery came when she clicked into the call logs. She counted once. She counted again. 17 calls to a single number in the last 10 days. The number belonged to Victor Slade. The disgraced former Chicago Police Department officer Bennett had sentenced to 7 years for excessive force. Maya's stomach tightened. The connection was unmistakable. This was no random stop. This was targeted. She picked up her phone. Jordan, she said with urgency. We have a problem far bigger than what we saw on the live stream, outside the precinct. Protesters began gathering as news alerts pushed through every major outlet. The live stream clip circulated across Chicago within minutes. The Tribune ran a breaking banner. WGN-TV aired the footage repeatedly. ABC Channel 7 interviewed Kevin Patel by phone. Social media erupted. Why was a federal judge in cuffs? Why was the car pulled over? Why had dispatch been ignored? The questions multiplied by the minute, and the answers formed a pattern no one could deny. Inside, Harlan attempted one final act of control. He approached Alicia with a forced sense of authority and said, Judge Bennett, you'll be released shortly. This was a misunderstanding. She looked up at him with a gaze that held decades of legal experience and said, with absolute calm, Sergeant, misunderstandings do not require deletion of evidence. The room fell silent. Vaughn's head lowered. Gonzalez watched from the corner. Knowing the world was about to learn the truth she had already risked everything to preserve. Alicia stood as the officers prepared to escort her out. She adjusted her coat, lifted her chin, and stepped toward the exit with the quiet dignity of someone who understood the moment better than anyone else. She knew this stop would not stay confined to a single station, or a single morning, or a single injustice. It would ripple into the case she was about to preside over. It would expose what had long remained hidden, and it would break open a system that had shielded misconduct for years. As the station door opened and the sound of protesters filled the air, Judge Alicia Bennett walked into the wind with the steady, solemn awareness that the fight for truth had already begun, and the evidence to win it was already on its way to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice launched its emergency investigation before the sun had fully risen, beginning with Samuel Wright opening an overnight envelope whose weight felt heavier than any case file he had handled in years, and when he pressed play on the raw footage Maria Gonzalez had mailed, he heard the whispered sentence that would redefine the entire case, make it look routine. The words were soft, but their meaning was unmistakable, carrying the full weight of intention, manipulation, and a deliberate attempt to disguise misconduct under the false cover of procedure. Within minutes, Wright convened a rapid response team, notified the Civil Rights Division, and drafted an emergency memorandum that would set the federal wheels into motion faster than the city had expected. At the same time, public outrage spread with unstoppable momentum. The protests outside the 18th District grew through the morning as more footage surfaced. Kevin Patel's bystander video reached 10 million views. Jordan Lee's live stream replayed across every local news channel. Opinion writers and civil rights advocates began connecting the dots of Vaughn's disciplinary record. What the city had tried to contain was now expanding by the hour. At the Dirksen courthouse, Maya Thompson delivered her findings to the chief judge, and a small group of federal attorneys assembled in a private conference room. Her voice remained steady even as the gravity of what she uncovered grew more alarming with each detail she shared. She explained the pattern of Vaughn's complaints, the gaps in the body cam logs, the deleted segments already discovered by digital forensics, and most importantly, the 17 calls to Victor Slade. When she handed over the printed call records, the room fell quiet. Every number had a timestamp. Every timestamp aligned with Vaughn's patrol shifts. The intentionality of the contact was irrefutable. One attorney whispered, "This isn't a mistake. This is a coordinated act." Another added, "This looks retaliatory." Maya corrected him with calm precision. "It is retaliatory, and the evidence supports that conclusion." The chief judge nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. A federal judge had been targeted, not by chance, but by design. While the courthouse prepared for emergency motions, police units across Chicago were put on alert as Department of Justice agents began executing rapid subpoenas for body cam backups, patrol logs, communication records, and internal correspondence. Lieutenant Gonzalez provided a protected whistleblower statement directly to Wright's team. She sat in a small room at the Department of Justice's Chicago field office, her voice steady, her composure controlled, recounting the timeline in exact detail. She explained how she arrived at the scene, what she heard, what she recorded, and how she chose to preserve the footage. Wright listened carefully. He asked no unnecessary questions. When she finished, he said only one sentence. "Lieutenant, your actions may have saved this entire investigation." Gonzalez lowered her eyes briefly, not in regret, but in acceptance of the cost. She knew what awaited her when she returned to her precinct. She also knew she could live with the consequences. Meanwhile, Chicago Police Department leadership scrambled to regain control. Chief Elena Ramirez arrived at the 18th District with measured urgency, her mind racing through the legal, political, and moral implications of the morning. When she asked Harlan where the body cam footage was, he hesitated for half a second too long. It was all she needed to confirm her suspicion. She requested immediate access to the storage logs. When she saw the missing files, her jaw tightened. "Sergeant, who authorized this deletion?" Harlan stammered, offering half explanations and vague procedural excuses. Ramirez cut him off. "You tampered with evidence involving a federal judge. As of this moment, you are suspended pending termination." Vaughn stood frozen beside him, his face pale, realizing the shield he had relied on was no longer intact. Ramirez turned to him. "Officer Vaughn, turn in your badge and weapon. Internal Affairs will be in contact." He started to protest. She did not let him finish. While the precinct absorbed the shock of the suspensions, the next revelation struck even harder. Officers outside Judge Bennett's home reported suspicious activity and discovered a man sitting in a parked car with binoculars resting on the passenger seat. A burner phone opened beside him. When officers ordered him out of the vehicle, he resisted for only a second before complying. His name was written on the booking form in firm, unmistakable strokes. Victor Slade, the man who blamed Alicia Bennett for the prison sentence he had earned. The man who had spent years nursing a grievance that grew sharper with every month he spent behind bars. On his phone were text messages to Vaughn. Wright read them aloud during the intake report. "She took 7 years of my life. Take something from her." The words were simple, bitter, and undeniably incriminating. The texts made the connection indisputable. The stop had been orchestrated. When news of Slade's arrest reached the public, outrage deepened. Protesters filled the sidewalks around the courthouse and the station, their signs rising above the crowd with phrases that reflected the shock of the morning. "Targeting a judge isn't policing. It's retaliation. We saw everything. Justice for Bennett." Inside the courthouse, the chief judge authorized an emergency hearing to address the growing crisis. Reporters filled the lobby. Federal marshals guarded the entrance. The tension in Chicago felt like a wire pulled too tightly, ready to snap. Chief Ramirez faced the press outside Chicago Police Department headquarters. Her voice was measured. Her expression was solemn. She confirmed the suspensions of Vaughn and Harlan. She confirmed the Department of Justice's involvement. And though she chose her words carefully, she did not attempt to shield misconduct. A federal judge was wrongfully detained. Evidence was withheld. This department will not tolerate retaliation or abuse of authority. Full accountability is underway. Her statement signaled a turning point. The blue wall had begun to crack, back inside the 18th District. Officers watched the news conference with mixed expressions: anger, fear, disbelief, and for some, relief that the truth was finally being acknowledged. Gonzalez entered the building quietly, knowing whispers would follow. She walked past Harlan's empty office, past Vaughn's cleared-out locker, past the officers who did not yet know she had been the one to save the footage. She did not gloat. She did not flinch. She carried herself with steady purpose, aware that the next chapter would demand even more courage. Samuel Wright issued a formal federal notice by mid-afternoon. The Department of Justice was assuming partial control of the investigation. He delivered the message in clear terms. This is a coordinated act of retaliation involving a sitting federal judge. The evidence shows intentional misconduct, organizational failure, and a breach of constitutional protections. A full pattern or practice inquiry is now underway. When Judge Alicia Bennett heard the news, she closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of the truth. The humiliation she endured on the street was not an isolated event. It was the tip of a conspiracy shaped by revenge, protected by silence, and supported by a system that had resisted reform for decades. But now the truth was exposed. The city had seen it. The nation had seen it. And for the first time in years, she felt something rise inside her, a quiet certainty that justice, long delayed, was finally gathering speed. The courtroom fell silent the moment Judge Alicia Bennett took her seat on the witness stand. not as the presiding judge, but as the central figure in a case that had already reshaped the city's conscience. And as she raised her right hand to take the oath, the gravity of the moment settled over the room with a weight that could be felt in every breath, every pause, every shift in posture. Cameras from national networks lined the back wall. Reporters filled the gallery. Federal marshals stood along the aisle. The air carried a quiet tension that signaled the beginning of something far larger than a single hearing. Judge Rebecca Goldstein, brought in from another district to avoid conflict, presided with solemn focus when she said, "Judge Bennett, you may begin." The courtroom leaned forward as one. Alicia's voice was calm, steady, and deliberate as she described the morning of her detention. She recounted how Officer Vaughn ignored her identification, how dispatch cleared her vehicle twice, how Sergeant Harlan allowed the search to continue even after recognizing her. She spoke without bitterness, but with clarity shaped by decades spent studying the patterns of power, how they rise, how they shift, and how they sometimes collapse in plain view. This, she said quietly, was not a mistake. This was a choice. Her words echoed in the silence that followed. Assistant State's Attorney Jordan Lee took the stand next, still wearing the same expression of moral urgency that had driven him to live stream the stop from the sidewalk hours earlier. He described what he saw, the moment he recognized Alicia, the disbelief he felt, and the instant understanding that something far deeper than a routine stop was taking place. He confirmed for the court that he heard no lawful justification for the detention. He confirmed that Vaughn had dismissed Alicia's federal identification, and when asked why he live-streamed, he answered simply, because the truth needed witnesses. His testimony, calm yet unwavering, reinforced the reality that the morning's events were not ambiguous. They were intentional, they were targeted, and they were caught on more than one camera. Kevin Patel followed. He sat upright, his hands folded, his voice soft but firm. He explained what prompted him to record, how he felt watching Alicia being handcuffed despite her calm explanation, and how the clip spread across social media. He recounted how strangers reached out to him within minutes, asking for the full video, demanding accountability, recognizing something profoundly wrong in the officer's posture and tone. When asked whether he felt threatened while filming, he nodded once and said, "Yes, but I knew it was important." He looked toward Alicia briefly, not for approval, but for acknowledgement, and she gave a quiet nod in return. Then came Lieutenant Maria Gonzalez. Her testimony marked the turning point in the hearing. She spoke in an even tone, choosing each word with care, neither embellishing nor softening the truth. She described arriving at the scene and activating her body camera audio. She recounted hearing Harlan whisper, "Make it look routine." She explained the exact steps she took to preserve the unedited footage, why she mailed it to the Department of Justice, and why she believed internal systems could not be trusted to protect the evidence. When asked why she risked her career, she answered with quiet strength, "Because the law applies to every one of us, or it applies to none of us." Her words carried the weight of principle, and they landed with the force of moral clarity. The courtroom grew still as Department of Justice Civil Rights Attorney Samuel Wright took the stand. He presented the raw footage that Gonzalez had sent, and the room watched the moment replayed on the large courtroom monitors. Harlan's whispered line filled the speakers, "Make it look routine." It played again, louder, then slower. Then the video showed the sequence of events exactly as they unfolded. Alicia identifying herself, dispatch clearing her vehicle, Vaughn ignoring the confirmation, the unnecessary handcuffing, and the orchestrated attempt to preserve the appearance of legitimacy. Wright then revealed the text messages recovered from Vaughn's phone. The screen displayed Slade's message in large, unmistakable letters. "She took 7 years of my life. Take something from her." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The chain of events was no longer speculation. The revenge motive was confirmed. The coordination was undeniable. The cover-up was intentional. Next came the testimony that sealed the narrative. Digital forensics experts explained the body cam deletions. Internal affairs investigators described inconsistencies in Vaughn's reports. Communications analysts linked Slade's phone location to the vicinity of the stop in the days leading up to it. The coordinated nature of the act grew clearer with each sentence, and with every passing minute. The courtroom moved further from the idea of a routine stop and closer to the unmistakable truth. A federal judge had been targeted through a conspiracy fueled by resentment and protected by silence. When Vaughn was brought in under federal subpoena, he appeared smaller than the uniform he once wore. His face was pale, his hands shook. He answered questions with long pauses, evasions, and contradictions. When pressed about Slade's messages, he looked down at the table, unable to speak. When asked why he ignored dispatch, he claimed confusion. When asked whether he recognized Alicia, he hesitated just long enough for the truth to become clear to everyone in the room. Harlan followed with similar evasions, but the evidence was overwhelming, and neither man could escape the reality closing in around them. Finally, Judge Bennett stepped forward to deliver her formal statement about the constitutional failures revealed by her stop and the long history of similar complaints across the city. She spoke with the precision of a jurist and the conviction of someone who had lived the consequences firsthand. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked for accountability. She did not ask for punishment. She asked for structural reform. This city, she said, pausing for a quiet breath, cannot protect civil rights selectively. We either stand for equal protection under the law, or we abandon the principle entirely. What happened to me happens to countless others who do not sit on the bench, and they deserve the same justice I will receive today. When she stepped down, the courtroom rose to its feet, not in applause, but in respect. The evidence stood unshakable. The truth stood undeniable, and the path toward federal intervention stood wide open. Illuminated by the morning's events and affirmed in sworn testimony broadcast across the nation, the hearing ended with a clarity Chicago had not seen in decades. The system had been exposed, the conspiracy laid bare, and the federal court was now poised to decide the future of policing in the city. The federal court issued the consent decree in a packed courtroom where every seat was filled, every aisle lined, and every word carried the weight of 4 decades of strained trust between the Chicago Police Department and the communities it served. And as Judge Rebecca Goldstein read the order aloud, the room absorbed each sentence with the solemn awareness that the city had reached a moment it could no longer postpone or negotiate away. The decree imposed 4 years of federal monitoring under the leadership of Department of Justice Civil Rights Attorney Samuel Wright, whose investigative clarity and unemotional precision in presenting the evidence had made him the natural choice to oversee the reforms. Wright stood beside the bench as Goldstein spoke, his posture steady, his expression focused, prepared for the long work ahead. The court outlined mandatory changes to training, traffic stop procedures, body camera protocol, civilian complaint tracking, supervisory accountability, and data transparency. Every requirement had a timeline. Every timeline had consequences. And when Goldstein reached the section referencing the events that triggered the decree, she paused briefly, allowing the weight of the findings to settle over the courtroom. The unlawful detention of Judge Alicia Marie Bennett, she read, occurred within a system that allowed patterns of racial profiling and retaliatory conduct to persist without meaningful oversight. This decree marks a structural remedy to prevent further violations. Those listening felt the sentence land with a quiet finality. Officer Derek Vaughn was terminated effective immediately. His file entered into the National Decertification Database. closing any path to future employment in law enforcement. His federal indictment followed within minutes of the decree. The charges included deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy, and obstruction. When the clerk read the indictment aloud, Vaughn stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, unable to reconcile the man he believed himself to be with the man he appeared to the nation. Sergeant Lyle Harlan stood beside him, not in uniform, but in civilian clothing. The insignia he once wore now replaced by the unremarkable posture of a man stripped of authority. His demotion to patrolman was formalized that afternoon, and his forced early retirement was announced 1 hour later. The department had chosen to sever ties swiftly, knowing the city's credibility depended on decisive action. Harlan's eyes drifted downward as the judge explained that his role in the attempted cover-up was an egregious breach of public trust. He did not speak. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging that the truth had finally caught up to him. Chief Elena Ramirez addressed reporters outside the courthouse after the ruling. She stood behind a row of microphones, her voice quiet but firm as she delivered a public apology to Judge Bennett. "What happened to her?" she said. "Never should have happened to anyone, regardless of rank, race, or title. The department failed in its duty to uphold constitutional rights. I stand here to accept responsibility and to commit this department to the full implementation of federal oversight." The apology was not theatrical. It was measured, grounded in the recognition that the city had reached a turning point. Behind Ramirez, the new leadership team stood in uniform, including the officers tasked with helping implement the reforms. Their presence symbolized the beginning of a different era, though none pretended the change would be easy. Inside the courthouse, Lieutenant Maria Gonzalez received the news of her promotion to captain, a role that placed her in command of the newly created Office of Constitutional Policing. The announcement happened quietly, in a small conference room where the chief judge and representatives from the Department of Justice met briefly to finalize the decree's early implementation steps. When Ramirez informed Gonzalez of the new assignment, the lieutenant stood still for a moment, absorbing the enormity of the responsibility. She understood what the role demanded, rooting out the very practices she had watched from inside the department for years, confronting a culture that resisted scrutiny, and working to rebuild trust with communities that had long stopped believing in the system. She accepted the position with a simple sentence: "I will serve with integrity." Her promotion represented the first structural shift within the department after the decree. Samuel Wright began outlining the monitoring framework within hours of the ruling. He issued a detailed plan that included independent audits of traffic stops, mandatory data collection on race and outcomes, unannounced precinct inspections, officer training evaluations, and public quarterly reports. He explained during a press briefing that oversight would not be symbolic or passive. "This decree," he said, "requires measurable compliance. The objective is not to supervise indefinitely, but to ensure sustainable reform." His tone was controlled, free from rhetoric, reflecting years of experience holding institutions to the standard of constitutional law. Reporters pressed him about timelines and potential resistance. He responded with quiet clarity. "Reform is the only path forward. Compliance is not optional." In her chambers, Judge Bennett reviewed the final draft of the decree before it was entered into the permanent record. She read the language with the perspective of someone who knew the consequences of inaction, not through theory, but through lived experience. She paused on the section referencing her own detention. Her breath slowed. She recognized the irony of being both the victim and the jurist, shaping the outcome of a system she had spent a lifetime evaluating. She did not dwell on the personal affront she had endured. Instead, she focused on the structural shifts embedded within the decree, the kind of changes she had spent years urging from the bench. When she finished reading, She closed the document with a quiet certainty that the morning humiliation she endured had been transformed into something far more consequential than an individual violation. It had become a catalyst for systemic change. Outside the courthouse, the city reacted with a mix of relief, grief, and renewed determination. Activists who had marched for years saw the decree as overdue recognition of what they had long documented. Community members expressed hope that the reforms would produce real change rather than temporary policy adjustments. Police officers, too, responded with varied emotions, some defensive, some reflective, others quietly grateful that the department would be forced to confront the issues that made their work harder and their credibility fragile. The decree touched every layer of the city. When evening fell, Chicago carried the sense of a chapter closing and another beginning. Vaughn sat alone in a holding room awaiting federal processing. Harlan signed his retirement papers with a final, shaky signature. Slade faced additional charges for his role in the conspiracy. Gonzalez reviewed her first report as incoming captain. Wright finalized the monitoring schedule. Ramirez prepared for the internal overhaul ahead, and Judge Bennett walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by quiet respect rather than cameras. Her steps calm, her posture steady, aware that justice does not arrive in sweeping gestures, but in measured, steady movements that reshape institutions from the inside out. The decree marked not the end of the story, but the beginning of the work ahead. And as the city exhaled under gray autumn skies, Chicago understood that for the first time in years. Reform was not a promise. It was an order, and it carried the full weight of federal law behind it. 6 months after the morning that shook the city, Chicago moved with a quieter rhythm, one shaped not by headlines but by measurable change, and as the latest quarterly report from the Federal Monitor's Office was released, the data spoke with a clarity that no speech or press conference could equal. Racial profiling complaints in traffic stops had dropped by 31%. Body camera compliance had reached an all-time high, and patrol supervisors were now required to document every discretionary stop with evidence stronger than intuition or suspicion, creating a new culture of accountability that grew slowly, steadily, and undeniably through each precinct. Meanwhile, Officer Derek Vaughn stood before a federal judge for sentencing, no longer the confident officer who once walked the streets with unrestrained authority, but a man stripped of the uniform he believed would shield him forever. He received 2 years probation and the permanent loss of his certification, a consequence that carried more finality than imprisonment. His badge was gone, his pension was gone, his future in law enforcement was gone. And though he attempted to offer a brief apology, his voice faltered under the weight of a courtroom that no longer viewed him as an officer, but as a man who had crossed a line from which there was no return. Sergeant Lyle Harlan lived in quiet exile on the city's far edge, retired in name but ostracized in practice. His career ended not with honors, but with the knowledge that his role in the cover-up had severed his relationship with the very city he once claimed to serve. His son stopped returning his calls. His former colleagues avoided him. His name became a cautionary tale whispered in academy training sessions under the section labeled Failures of Leadership. And though he tried to rebuild a semblance of normalcy, the silence surrounding him grew heavier by the month. A reminder that the collapse of trust often carries the longest shadow. Victor Slade, already marked by the anger that had shaped the conspiracy, faced the sharpest legal blow. The additional 5-year sentence imposed for his role in the retaliation sealed his fate with a final, crushing certainty. As he was led out of the courtroom in restraints, he glanced toward Judge Bennett for a fleeting moment. Not with defiance, but with the faint recognition that his attempt at vengeance had only lengthened the very future he had tried to destroy for her. The city, too, had undergone its own transformation. Traffic stop numbers shifted in ways analysts had long predicted would occur only under strong external pressure. Communities that had once refused to file complaints out of fear or resignation now stepped forward with renewed willingness, trusting that oversight would not vanish into bureaucratic dust. The Federal Monitor, Samuel Wright, released public memos every quarter, each one outlining areas of compliance, areas of concern, and areas demanding immediate correction. His reports were not decorative. They carried corrective timelines. They carried teeth. And the department complied because the alternative was no longer tolerable. In a small corner of the city's north side, Kevin Patel began gathering signatures for his run as alderman. The idea had started as a suggestion from neighbors who admired his courage the morning he filmed the stop. Over time, it became a community effort. People printed his video stills on flyers. Local journalists interviewed him. Civic groups encouraged him. He walked his neighborhood with a clipboard. Speaking with the same quiet conviction he showed the morning he lifted his phone and captured the truth. His candidacy became a symbol of ordinary citizens stepping into the public space to demand a better city. And as his campaign gained momentum, he found himself invited to speak on panels about transparency, accountability, and the power of witnessing. Chief Elena Ramirez spent her days implementing the reforms that federal oversight required, and her nights reviewing internal culture surveys that revealed slow but steady progress. She carried the memory of her public apology to Judge Bennett as a quiet reminder of what leadership required: honesty, accountability, and the willingness to confront the institution she had sworn to uphold. Her role became more demanding than she had anticipated. Not because of the workload, but because of the emotional weight of reshaping a department that had resisted change for generations. She did the work anyway, not out of obligation, but out of conviction. Captain Maria Gonzalez led her new Office of Constitutional Policing with measured strength. She began each morning by reviewing body cam audits, analyzing stop data, and meeting with community advocates who had long been dismissed. Her leadership style blended firmness with humanity, drawing respect from younger officers and cautious hope from older ones. She understood that reform meant more than policy. It meant culture, and culture changed slowly, one decision at a time, under her guidance. New recruits learned that integrity was not an abstract value, but a daily practice embedded in every interaction, every report, every stop. In her chambers, Judge Alicia Bennett reviewed the latest legal filings connected to the consent decree. Her staff moved carefully around her, aware that the last 6 months had reshaped not only her schedule, but her entire public role. Her courtroom became a symbol of transparency, a place where data, not rhetoric, determined the truth of the city's claims. On the morning of the Academy's opening ceremony, a training center built under the decree and named the Bennett Protocol Academy. She walked the hallway with deliberate, steady steps. The academy had been created to train officers in constitutional policing, ethical decision-making, and community partnership. It included classrooms, simulation labs, and a full curriculum built around the principles she had championed for years. As she stood beside Ramirez and Gonzalez during the ribbon-cutting ceremony, she felt a quiet sense of closure, not victory, not triumph, but closure. The kind that comes from seeing tangible change rise from an experience meant to diminish her. Reporters asked her to speak. She stepped to the podium, paused, and let the silence settle before she began. "Justice," she said softly, "rarely arrives in a single dramatic moment. It arrives slowly, through persistence, through accountability, through truth. The events that brought us here were painful. They were unjust. But they were not the end of the story." Her voice carried the emotional rhythm of someone who had lived through humiliation and emerged with purpose, not vengeance. As the ceremony ended, she returned to the courthouse for an afternoon docket. She placed her hand on the gavel, the familiar weight grounding her. She looked out over the courtroom, filled with attorneys, defendants, clerks, and visitors, each representing a piece of the city she had served her entire life. She lifted the gavel once, brought it down gently, and said, "Court is in session." In that simple sentence, Chicago felt the steady forward movement of justice, quiet, deliberate, and undeniably real. Thank you for watching. If you value stories like this, please subscribe and leave a like.